I had never imagined my life would lead me to this point. The idea of manipulating the truth, of fabricating something as serious as abuse, seemed so foreign to me. But the past few months had pushed me to the edge. The emotional weight of my marriage had become unbearable. I was suffocating, trapped in a relationship where I no longer saw a way out. It wasn't the physical abuse, no, never that, but the emotional warfare, the constant belittling, the silence that screamed louder than any argument. I remember the first time I realized I was stuck. My husband, Ethan, was never violent in the traditional sense. He didn't raise his fists or shout, no, he had mastered a far more insidious form of control. It was in the little things, the dismissive comments, the condescending looks, the ways he made me feel like I was incapable of living without him. It wasn't love anymore. It had become a silent prison. I spent nights lying awake, wondering how my life had turned into this. I thought about the friends I had lost touch with, the adventures I used to dream about. But now, I was just surviving. I would wake up each morning, play the role of the dutiful wife, and go through the motions. But something inside me snapped when I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was dying, piece by piece, every day. Then came the conversation with Claire, my longtime friend. We were having one of our rare catch-up sessions, and I let the floodgates open. I told her everything. The way Ethan had manipulated me into feeling like I was always at fault, the way he'd convinced me that I needed him more than he needed me. She listened, offering comforting words, but I could tell she was getting impatient with me. She had always been a do-something-about-it kind of person, while I had become an expert at internalizing my misery. And then she said something that changed everything. If you're so unhappy, just leave him. You don't have to keep living like this. Just get a divorce. It was simple enough. But I couldn't. Not without risking everything. Without a reason, I would be stuck in a long, drawn-out process, full of complications and hurt. It was then that the idea hit me. A false claim. A fabricated story of abuse. If I could just get him to look bad enough in front of everyone, the divorce would be inevitable. It wasn't a nice thought, but the more I turned it over in my mind, the more it seemed like the only way out. I spent days thinking it through. I'd watched enough TV dramas to know how it worked. A claim of physical abuse would surely make Ethan look like the villain. The law would side with me. The divorce would go through, and I would have my freedom. There was one problem: the story had to be convincing. It couldn't be some half-hearted attempt. I needed to have all the details in place, something that would make people believe it. And so, I started to plan. I thought about how to make it seem real, how to present the evidence. The truth didn't matter, it never did in these situations. What mattered was the narrative I could build. I told myself it was for the best. I wasn't hurting anyone. I was just setting myself free. It wasn't the life I wanted anymore, and I didn't want to keep living this way. The idea of freedom was too tempting, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of control again. The night I made the decision, I felt oddly calm. I had convinced myself that this was the only way to fix things. Ethan had no idea what was coming. I went to bed early, pretending to be exhausted, and waited for him to fall asleep. I needed everything to go according to plan. My heart was racing as I rehearsed the words in my head. The lie was simple but effective: he had hit me. The next morning, I knew I had to act fast. Ethan had always been emotionally distant, and I used that to my advantage. He didn't suspect a thing. When I made the claim, I kept my voice steady, trying to convince him of my sincerity. I played the role of the distraught wife, the victim of an unprovoked attack. I knew how to pull on his heartstrings, how to make him feel guilty, and I used every ounce of that power. I told him I couldn't stay in a marriage like this anymore. That I needed space, that I couldn't live under the same roof as someone who could hurt me. I saw the look of disbelief in his eyes, but I pushed through. He didn't understand. He never did. I had to force him into a corner, make him react in a way that would prove my story to be true. I didn't expect it to feel so strange. For a brief moment, guilt crept in. Was I really going to do this? Was this really the best way to handle things? But then I remembered how he had treated me for so long. The tears, the accusations, the silent treatment. I reminded myself that this wasn't just a lie, it was my escape. I couldn't back out now. That afternoon, I went to the police. The officers took my statement with a seriousness I hadn't expected. I had rehearsed every detail, and when they asked me about the abuse, I gave them exactly what they wanted to hear. I told them Ethan had hit me during an argument, and I described how I had managed to get away. The officers seemed sympathetic, and I felt a strange sense of relief. The divorce was just around the corner. My freedom, the life I had dreamed of, seemed almost within reach. But little did I know that the path I had chosen would take me somewhere I never imagined. The days after I made the claim felt like I was walking in a fog. I had convinced myself that this was the only way forward, the only way to escape the suffocating grip of my marriage. But now that I had taken that step, I was left with an overwhelming sense of unease. It was like I had crossed a line, and I couldn't go back. The guilt gnawed at me, but I tried to push it aside, focusing instead on the fact that my life was about to change. I would be free. At first, everything seemed to unfold according to plan. Ethan didn't fight it. In fact, he seemed completely blindsided, unsure of how to handle the situation. He didn't deny the allegations right away, and I took that as a sign that I was in the clear. I had never expected him to fight back like this. He was always so controlled, so calculating, that I assumed he'd accept the divorce quietly. But that didn't happen. He was in shock, of course. When I first told him I couldn't stay in the marriage anymore, he looked at me like I had just slapped him. He asked me why I was doing this, why I was accusing him of something so heinous. He had no idea, of course. How could he? The lies I had told him were so well-crafted, so precise, that even I began to believe them. But then the wheels started turning in his head. Ethan wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let someone tarnish his reputation without a fight. He might have been passive in our marriage, but when it came to defending himself, he was fierce. It was then that the questions started coming, those questions that made me doubt myself. He asked me, almost too calmly, "How did this happen? Why didn't you say anything before?" And the more he asked, the more I realized how fragile my story was. I had thought I could maintain control over the narrative, that I could convince everyone of my version of the truth. But now, I could see that it wasn't going to be so easy. The divorce process started moving faster than I expected, and soon, I was sitting across from a lawyer, signing papers that would change everything. But even as I made the decision to push forward, a part of me started to panic. What if Ethan didn't give up so easily? What if he fought back in ways I couldn't predict? That's when I started noticing the small cracks in my plan. My friends, the ones who had been so supportive at first, began to distance themselves. At first, it was subtle. A text message here and there, a little hesitation in their responses. But as the divorce proceedings progressed, it became clear that they weren't as sure of my story as I had hoped. They began to ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. One of them, Jenna, the one I had confided in the most, asked me how I could have stayed in a marriage like that for so long if things were so bad. "Why didn't you leave earlier? Why did it take something so drastic?" she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. I felt the walls closing in. The very people who had supported me, who had agreed that I needed to get out of the marriage, were now questioning everything. And that's when I realized that the story I had built wasn't as airtight as I had thought. There were gaps, things I hadn't considered. It was one thing to lie to Ethan, but now I had to lie to everyone else, too. But then something happened that I hadn't expected. Ethan started to dig. I didn't know it at first, but he had hired a private investigator. At first, the investigator's job was simple: gather evidence that would prove I had fabricated the abuse claims. But as the investigator went through our history, they started uncovering inconsistencies. Minor details, at first. Things I hadn't thought to cover up. A conversation we had with friends, a trip we'd taken together, small things that didn't match up with the story I had told. The investigator found my lie, and once he had the evidence, Ethan was ready to fight back. He wasn't just going to let me take everything from him without a battle. The next thing I knew, he was accusing me of false reporting, of deliberately ruining his life. The private investigator had even dug up old emails, messages, and social media posts that proved I had fabricated the story of abuse. Ethan presented them to my lawyer, and suddenly, my life was spiraling out of control. It was no longer just about getting a divorce. It was about protecting myself from the consequences of my actions. I had thought the worst was behind me, but now I realized how wrong I was. Ethan wasn't going to let me walk away unscathed. He was going to make sure that everyone knew the truth, that I had lied about him. That I had ruined his life with a single, fabricated claim. I sat in my apartment one night, staring at the walls, trying to process everything. The life I had planned, the life I thought I would have after the divorce, was slipping through my fingers. My friends were pulling away, my family was beginning to question me, and now my husband was fighting back with everything he had. I had never imagined it would come to this. I had never imagined I would end up on the other side of the truth, trying to defend myself against the very lie I had told. I didn't know what to do next. How could I fix this? How could I undo the damage I had caused? The lie had taken on a life of its own, and now it was bigger than me. I was in too deep, and there was no way out. I had created a mess that I wasn't sure I could clean up. All I could do now was wait and hope that somehow, some miracle would happen. But deep down, I knew there was no going back. The days following Ethan's counterattack felt like a whirlwind. I had expected him to take the hit, to crumble under the weight of the accusations, but instead, he was coming at me with a vengeance. He wasn't going to let me destroy him without a fight. The more I tried to convince myself that everything would be okay, the more I realized just how much control he had over the situation now. It wasn't just about the divorce anymore, it was about his reputation, his life, and he was going to do everything in his power to clear his name. It all came crashing down when I received a call from my lawyer. I could hear the concern in her voice as she told me that Ethan had filed a lawsuit against me for defamation. The private investigator had uncovered more than just inconsistencies in my story, they had found hard evidence that I had fabricated the entire abuse claim. My lawyer explained that Ethan was demanding not only a divorce but also financial restitution for the harm I had caused him. My heart sank. This wasn't just a divorce anymore, it was a fight for my freedom, my future. I had never anticipated that my lie would come back to haunt me like this. The idea of a lawsuit hadn't even crossed my mind when I made the false claim. I had been so focused on getting out of my marriage, on securing my own freedom, that I hadn't considered the legal consequences of lying about abuse. And now, I was facing a legal battle that could ruin everything. My criminal record was already taking shape, the stain of false accusations following me wherever I went. I tried to stay calm, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. My lawyer suggested that we settle, but I refused. I couldn't let Ethan win. Not after everything he had put me through. I didn't care if it meant losing everything. I wasn't going to let him make me the villain in this story. So, we fought. And every move I made felt like it was pushing me further into a corner I couldn't escape from. The pressure was suffocating. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was losing control over everything in my life. The friends who had once stood by me were now pulling away, no longer sure of my side of the story. Claire, who had been my confidant, was no longer answering my calls. The guilt and shame were eating at me, but I refused to let them show. I had made this choice, and now I had to see it through. I remember the moment I saw the first news report. A local newspaper had picked up on the story, and suddenly, the entire town knew about my allegations. The headline was simple: "Woman accuses husband of abuse, files for divorce." At first, I felt relief. It had worked. My story was out there, and it was too late for anyone to question it. But as I read the article, I felt the weight of my lie pressing down on me. The report didn't mention the lawsuit, the private investigator, or the mounting evidence that I had made everything up. It only told my version of the story, the one I had carefully constructed. I didn't know how to feel. A part of me wanted to run, to leave everything behind and start fresh somewhere else. But another part of me couldn't escape the reality that I had done this. I had made a decision that was now unraveling everything. The lie had taken on a life of its own, and I couldn't control it anymore. The criminal record was inevitable. My lawyer had explained that it was a matter of when, not if, I would be charged with filing a false report. I had made a mistake, a huge one, and now I was going to have to pay the price. As the days passed, I tried to keep up the facade of confidence. I continued to go to work, pretending that everything was normal, but inside, I was falling apart. The guilt was unbearable. I was living with the consequences of my actions, and it was slowly destroying me. I couldn't shake the image of Ethan's face when I told him about the abuse. I had hurt him, manipulated him, and now I was going to pay the price for it. The worst part was knowing that I couldn't take it back. There was no way to undo the damage I had caused. The lie was out there, and no matter how much I wished I could turn back time, it was too late. My future was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Ethan, for his part, was playing the role of the victim to perfection. He had made sure everyone knew that I had lied, that I had tried to ruin his life with false accusations. He had his lawyer send me a letter demanding that I drop the lawsuit, that I admit my fault and apologize publicly. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I wasn't going to let him take the high road, to make me look like the one who was in the wrong. I wasn't going to be the one who lost. But as the weeks went on, the pressure mounted. I started to lose friends, to lose support. Even my family began to question my actions. My mother called me one evening, her voice shaking with emotion. "What have you done, honey? What happened to you? This isn't you. You can't let this lie ruin your life." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had ruined my life, and there was no way to fix it. I couldn't help but wonder if I had been foolish to think that I could control everything. The lie had spiraled out of my hands, and now I was facing the reality of the mess I had created. There were days when I couldn't sleep, when I couldn't stop thinking about how it had all gone so horribly wrong. I had wanted to escape, to start over, but now I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. It was too late to turn back. The criminal record was inevitable, the legal battle was just beginning, and all I could do was keep pushing forward, even though I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The courtroom was quiet, attention hanging in the air as I stood at the defendant's table. My lawyer whispered something in my ear, but I could hardly hear her. My thoughts were consumed by the weight of what I had done. The false accusations, the lies I had told, and the consequences that had unfolded in the wake of my actions. Ethan sat across the room, his face calm, almost serene, as if he had already won. He had been waiting for this moment, and I could feel his quiet victory radiating from him. I glanced at the judge, who was reviewing the papers in front of him. The evidence was clear. I had fabricated the abuse claim, and now I was facing the legal consequences. The weight of my own guilt pressed down on me like a 1,000-pound stone. It wasn't just about losing the case anymore. It was about the irreversible damage I had caused to myself and to the people around me. Ethan's life had been turned upside down because of me, and now I was the one standing here, about to lose everything I had worked so hard to build. I remembered the first day I walked into this courtroom. I had been so certain that I could win, that the lie would be enough to set me free. But now, as I looked at the people who had gathered here today, family, friends, and strangers, it was clear that the lie had only deepened the hole I had dug for myself. I had hoped that the truth would come out, that I would be vindicated, but instead, it had become my downfall. The judge finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. "Ms. Bennett, you are here today to answer for the false accusations you made against your husband, Mr. Ethan Bennett. The evidence presented by the defense is overwhelming, and the damage caused by your actions is considerable. The court has found you guilty of filing a false report of abuse. You will be facing the legal consequences of your actions, including a criminal record." I felt my heart drop as the words echoed in my ears. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. I had been living in a fog for so long, believing that somehow I could make it all go away, but now the truth was out, and it was more painful than anything I could have imagined. Ethan, who had been so steadfast in his pursuit of justice, had won. He was right. I had been wrong. The judge continued, but I barely heard his words. It felt like I was sinking, the weight of my own choices dragging me down. The thought of a criminal record, the thought of losing my reputation, my job, my friends, it was all too much. I had made a terrible mistake, and now I had to face the consequences. There was no way to undo what I had done, no way to take back the damage. The verdict was delivered. I was to serve probation and attend mandatory counseling for a year. My criminal record would remain, a constant reminder of my lie. But it wasn't just the legal consequences that hurt. It was the realization that I had lost everything I truly cared about. Ethan was no longer in my life, and even if we had a chance at reconciliation, it would never be the same. He had been devastated by my actions, and no apology would ever undo the pain I had caused him. I couldn't help but think about the life I had once dreamed of. I had wanted to escape my marriage, to be free from the constraints that had held me down for so long. But in my pursuit of freedom, I had lost myself. The person I had been before the lie had been someone I could respect, someone who cared about honesty and integrity. But that person had disappeared, replaced by someone who was willing to do anything to get what she wanted, even if it meant hurting the people she loved. As I left the courtroom, the cold reality of my actions hit me harder than ever. The people who had supported me in the beginning now looked at me with disappointment, and I couldn't blame them. I had betrayed their trust, and no amount of regret could change that. The only thing I had left was the painful truth that I had brought this upon myself. The road ahead would be difficult. I didn't know how I was going to rebuild my life, or if I even could. My career was in jeopardy, my reputation was shattered, and my future was uncertain. The criminal record would follow me wherever I went, a permanent mark on my history. I had chosen this path, and now I was paying the price. But in the midst of all the pain and regret, there was a small flicker of something else. It was the realization that I had learned something about myself, something that I couldn't have known without this experience. I had learned the value of honesty, the importance of facing my problems head-on rather than running from them. I had learned that shortcuts and lies only led to destruction, and that the truth, no matter how painful, was always the better path. As I walked away from the courthouse, I knew that the road to redemption would be long and difficult. But I also knew that it was the only path I could take. I couldn't change the past, but I could change the future. I would rebuild my life, one step at a time, and I would never make the same mistake again. The damage I had done couldn't be undone, but I could try to make things right, even if it meant starting over from the ground up. In the end, that was all I could do, move forward and learn from the mistakes I had made. And maybe, just maybe, I could find some peace along the way.